Alright, welcome to the Strange North channel. In this video, I'm going to tell you about the gang situation in the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba. And right off the bat, I have to address something publicly. In the last couple of gang videos that I produced, I repeatedly used incorrect terms for Indigenous people. There were a bunch of times I said the word Indian or Aboriginal instead of Indigenous. And honestly, I'm really embarrassed by this. I should have really taken the time to educate myself on proper terms, especially when dealing with such a contentious issue. And so I've really been educated and I see where I went wrong, and most importantly, I am going to use the proper terms going forward. I know that I'm going to get hate being on YouTube, but I don't want it to be because of stupid mistakes that I've made. And I'd rather make friends than enemies, and I certainly didn't mean any disrespect. I actually pinned a comment on my Gangs of Edmonton video where I corrected myself for saying Indian and Hobima instead of Indigenous and Masquatchee. And a bunch of people commented saying things along the lines of, hey man, it's okay, we say Indian, etc. And I appreciate that you said that. I know you're just trying to say, hey man, I get where your heart is and that you made a mistake. And I mean, Indigenous people can say whatever words they want to describe themselves, but I can't. I also wanted to say that in these gang videos, I'm really only using publicly available information that has been covered many times by other YouTubers and news outlets. I'm sure you realize this is a subject where I have to tread very carefully, but I don't want to be too timid. I still want to tackle the subject, but give a broad overview that isn't too incriminating, if you know what I mean. And I don't know if I should mention this, but I wanted to. These gang videos that I've done, they've had a lot of views, but I'm not really making that much money on them. My channel is monetized now, but those gang videos have been flagged, and so I'm making a couple bucks. But I just wanted to say that in case someone thought I was really profiting off these videos. I'm not really at all. But I am trying to become successful at YouTube one day, and so I'm committed to improving my skills and bringing people videos that provide a bit of value. And so with that said, let's get into the Gangs of Winnipeg video. Every city and town in Canada has some sort of gang activity, but there are really two cities that stand out for me, and those cities are Montreal and Winnipeg. But in terms of the prairie region of Canada, Winnipeg really has a reputation for having a lot of gang activity, and many prominent street gangs have had their origins in the city of Winnipeg. And I'm going to start this video talking about the Manitoba Warriors. I didn't really go too much into them in my previous videos. And so the Manitoba Warriors were formed as a prison gang in 1993 at the Stony Mountain Prison, and this group was founded by William Pangman, who served for many years as the national president. Like a lot of other street gangs, the Manitoba Warriors were formed in prison to sort of protect themselves from being recruited by other gangs. And after members of this new group were released from prison, they would recruit others from their neighborhoods. And a lot of their recruits came from the legendary north end of Winnipeg, which has seen a lot of poverty and gang activity. So the Manitoba Warriors used to purchase their drugs from the Los Bravos biker gang led by a man named Ernie Dew. And when the Los Bravos eventually joined the Hells Angels, this alliance continued with the Manitoba Warriors, and the Angels would continue to supply the Warriors with their drugs. In terms of gang colors, the Manitoba Warriors use black and white as the colors to represent their group. Over the years, the Manitoba Warriors have had a very violent feud with the Indian Posse gang, another very prominent street gang that was started in Winnipeg. On April 25th of 1996, there was a massive riot between the two gangs at the Headingley Correctional Institution, and it lasted 8 hours. This riot caused $7 million in damage, and after everything was settled, there were 8 guards and 31 inmates that had to be treated for injuries. I'm honestly surprised that no one died in this riot. It was definitely one of the most notorious riots in Canadian penitentiary history. And this riot really solidified the reputation of the Manitoba Warriors, and it led to a wave of new recruits in Winnipeg after this happened. There's another story from 1996 that I wanted to highlight. So that year, there was a dispute on the Waterhen Reserve when local band chief Harvey Nepinak, I hope I'm saying that right, was accused of embezzlement. And Mr. Nepinak wasn't willing to disclose the band council's financial records, and he actually used the band council funds to move himself and his supporters to a hotel in Dauphin. When this happened, the federal government didn't intervene, and they said that the dispute was an internal affair within the Waterhen Reserve. And so when this happened, Mr. Nepinak had left the reserve, and this anti-Nepinak faction had formed, and this group actually hired the Manitoba Warriors to serve as an alternative police force on the reserve. The Criminal Intelligence Service of Canada actually used the Waterhen dispute as an example of how the government had lost all respect in First Nations communities to such an extent that it was actually considered acceptable to have a gang serve as an unofficial police force on a reserve. There's a man named Ovid Mercredi, I hope I'm saying his name right, and he's actually a very prominent Cree politician in Canada. And in 1996, during the time of this dispute, dispute on the Waterhen Reserve, Ovid Mercredi was actually the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, and he met with the leaders of both the Manitoba Warriors and the Indian Posse. And after meeting with these two groups, he said he was, quote, convinced the young men representing these gangs were the true leaders in their community, end quote. Don Lett, who wrote for the Winnipeg Free Press, wrote an article where he talked about these meetings between Ovid Mercredi and the gang leaders. And this is a quote from his article. Mercredi said that he found the gang members unexpectedly spiritual and fully engaged in culture and prayers. Sessions in jail usually opened with a prayer and with the burning of the sweetgrass. The gang members claimed they had banded together to create a sense of brotherhood or collective security against a world many of them felt had excluded them from basic opportunities to learn and work. Now, Ovid Mercredi later apologized for these remarks, and he stated that gangs such as the Indian Posse and the Manitoba Warriors were, quote, disastrous for First Nations communities. And so I just wanted to highlight that story because, yes, obviously gangs have done terrible things. Everyone agrees with that. But the impetus to join a gang is very complicated, and it seems like scholars have done a lot of work on this and shown that a lot of people join gangs simply because they want a family and brotherhood. They feel like they don't have any opportunities, and this organization is giving them friendship and family and a little bit of hope for the future in a very bleak environment. But I also don't want to shy away from the fact that gangs do terrible things. I mean, even in the case of the Manitoba Warriors, there's a well-known case of a member of this gang named Bernard Cook, who, after having a spiritual awakening and trying to leave the gang, was brutally tortured and murdered by the gang for doing this. And the fact is that individual members of the Manitoba Warriors have done some horrendous things within the city of Winnipeg. And so the public opinion on this group is very divided. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the Indian Posse. I'm going to talk a little bit less about them in this video just because I covered them a bit more in previous videos, but I'll try to include some tidbits that I didn't talk about in other videos. The Indian Posse is perhaps the largest street gang in Canada, certainly in the prairies, and they have a real reputation across the country. The gang was started by Richard and Danny Wolf in 1988 in Winnipeg's notorious North End, particularly around the Lord Selkirk Park housing development, an area known as Little Chicago. The Indian Posse uses the color red to represent the group, and they have rules of not taking hard drugs, not speaking to outsiders about gang activities, and something called minutes of pain, where essentially if someone is joining the gang, they have to be beat up pretty severely for a number of minutes to prove their toughness. And over time, the Indian Posse have become one of the most dominant street gangs in Canada, and they've expanded well beyond Winnipeg across Canada, particularly in the prairie region of the country. The two brothers that started the Indian Posse actually passed away in Saskatchewan prisons. Danny Wolf was murdered in prison in January of 2010, and Richard Wolf had a heart attack in prison in May of 2016. The Indian Posse's main rivals are the Hells Angels, the Manitoba Warriors, Red Alert, and the White Boy Posse, although the White Boy Posse have definitely been diminishing and a lot of their members have joined other groups. The Indian Posse actually has an interesting alliance with the West End gang out of Montreal. This is a prominent Irish gang that essentially controls the port of Montreal, and they have for many years. And the West End gang has a serious reputation in that city. And the story goes, while Danny Wolf was serving a prison sentence in 2003 to 2004, he became friends with a man named Jerry Maddox, who was the imprisoned boss of the West End gang in Montreal. And it turned out that Jerry Maddox, although being incredibly successful, was actually illiterate. And Danny Wolf, who could read and write very well, would read and write letters for Mr. Maddox. And this sort of led to the Indian Posse forming an alliance with the West End gang, and this really proved to be very profitable for them over the years. And I think it's fair to say that the Manitoba Warriors and the Indian Posse are the two major street gangs in the city of Winnipeg. Many people will disagree with this, and there's really many gangs in the city, but I would consider those two to be the dominant street gangs in the city. There's also a gang called the Manitoba Blood Family. This gang was started by Bloods who were incarcerated inside Stony Mountain Penitentiary to fight back against recruitment from rivals such as the Crips and the Indian Posse. And the Manitoba Blood Family quickly developed a little reputation of their own, and they also quickly developed a rivalry with the Manitoba Warriors, and these two groups have had significant conflicts over the years. You also have the Native Syndicate. I've talked about them extensively in other videos. They were formed in 1994. The Native Syndicate uses black and white as their gang colors, and they're mainly active in Manitoba and Saskatchewan with a definite presence in Winnipeg. This gang actually started in the prison system in Saskatchewan and then spread to the rest of the prairies. The Native Syndicate also uses a Mafia style structure where they have a boss, underboss, and consigliere as sort of the leadership of the group. And the Native Syndicate are rivals to the Indian Posse, Manitoba Warriors, Red Alert, Mad Cowz, but they have rough alliances with the Hells Angels, the African Mafia, and the Zigzag Crew. There's another gang called the Most Organized Brothers, and they are linked on and off with the larger Manitoba Warriors gang. This group consists of former members of another gang called Cash Money Brothers, and the Most Organized Brothers was noticed by police in Winnipeg in 2006, and I actually found a 2012 article from the Winnipeg Sun calling this group, quote, a major threat. This gang is really known for stealing cars in Winnipeg and selling them to larger international crime syndicates. The Most Organized Brothers also have close ties with the Rock Machine Motorcycle Club, and they have been involved with their conflicts with the Hells Angels. But this gang also has a serious rivalry with the Indian Posse, and there have been many violent conflicts between the two groups. I also wanted to mention another couple gangs that are active in Winnipeg that I talked about extensively in my previous gang videos. First off, you have the Red Alert. This gang was formed in Edmonton in the early 1990s after prisoners were transferred to Edmonton prisons from Stony Mountain Penitentiary in Manitoba, and this group largely formed to protect themselves from attacks and recruitment from the Manitoba Warriors and the Indian Posse. But since a lot of its members had ties to Manitoba, Red Alert eventually established a foothold in the city of Winnipeg, and it has maintained a presence there ever since. And then you also have the Terror Squad gang active in Winnipeg as well, and this is really the most dominant street gang in the city of Saskatoon. Terror Squad first came on Saskatoon police radar in 2006. This gang also uses black and white as their gang colors, particularly a paisley black and white bandana. And the Terror Squad gang has spread across Saskatchewan, and they have a definite presence in the city of Winnipeg as well. And then next up is a gang called the Mad Cowz. The Mad Cowz were formed in 2004, and this is predominantly an African gang. And while they've mainly been involved in selling crack cocaine, they also distribute a number of other drugs, and they've been involved in many other criminal enterprises as well. And the Mad Cowz have serious rivalries with the Manitoba Warriors as well as the African Mafia gang. And that brings us to the African Mafia gang, and really these two gangs highlight the African gangs in Winnipeg. And I just say that because Edmonton and Calgary don't really have the same prominent African-based gangs as Winnipeg does. The African Mafia actually splintered off from the Mad Cowz gang around 2005. And these groups are made up primarily of young men who immigrated to Canada from war-torn parts of Eastern Africa. And like the Mad Cowz that the African Mafia split off from, they are mostly involved in selling crack cocaine, but they really deal a variety of drugs as well, and they've been involved in other crimes too. Now I'm going to talk about some smaller gangs, and I'm going to list a bunch of smaller gangs in Winnipeg, and I'm definitely going to leave something out, and I'm going to piss someone off here, but these are just some of the smaller gangs that are present in Winnipeg that don't have as big a presence as some of the other gangs I've just listed. You've got the 334 Mob Squad, Good Squad, the Junior Warriors, the Crazies, the Renegades, the Ruthless Crew, the West Side Bloods, the Crips, the West Side Outlaws, the Deuce Gang, Troublesome Bloods, South Broadway Gang, the Crazy Indian Nomads, the North Side Blood Gang, the Cash Money Bloods. These are all smaller gangs within the city, and some of them may or may not be active. And of course, in Winnipeg, like across the country, you've got the Hells Angels. This is an outlaw motorcycle club founded in California in the 1940s. It was actually largely founded by war veterans, and so these guys have a really proud history that's very complicated. The Hells Angels are now an international club with charters across the globe, and they're probably the most dominant club overall in Canada. And since they're pretty high level, you don't hear a ton about them. Yes, they are active in Winnipeg. In fact, I found a 2022 article talking about the fact that RCMP in Manitoba made a bunch of arrests, including that of a high-ranking Hells Angel, and this was the largest drug seizure in Manitoba RCMP history. That's really saying a lot. And so the Hells Angels are definitely active in Winnipeg, but you really don't see or hear them that much. They're very high level and fairly low-key. And then I also have to mention the Zigzag Crew. This is actually a Hells Angels puppet club, and it's mostly made up of Caucasian and Indigenous members. These guys have actually developed quite a reputation in Winnipeg, and they're quite feared by a lot of people. They're mostly involved in drug distribution, and the Zigzag Crew is friendly with the Native Syndicate gang. But the Zigzag Crew does have strong rivalries with the Rock Machine Motorcycle Club as well as the Manitoba Warriors. And of course, that brings us to the Rock Machine Motorcycle Club. This is another international outlaw motorcycle club. It was founded in Montreal in 1986, and interestingly, it was actually founded by Salvatore Cazzetta and his brother Giovanni Cazzetta Pizzetta, who are strongly connected to the Rizzuto crime family of Montreal. And the Rock Machine is active across the country, but for a time they were actually quite dominant within the city of Winnipeg. In 2008, police busted a bunch of Hells Angels and really diminished their capacity within Winnipeg. And this sort of led to a power vacuum where for a time the Rock Machine became the dominant club in the city. But of course things are complicated, and the Rock Machine also faced competition from other gangs and pressure from the police. And they've had a lot of issues, and they're really no longer the dominant motorcycle club in the city, but they definitely still have a presence. And so that pretty much wraps up my video on the gangs in Winnipeg. I just wanted to do an overview in case people were interested, and I probably shouldn't be saying this because I do want people to watch my videos. But honestly, there's a much better YouTube channel dealing with gangs in Canada. It's called Hood Chronicles. And basically all of the gangs that I've mentioned, this YouTube channel has done extensive videos really going into the details of some of these groups. So I'm just kind of giving an overview, but if you are interested in going further with some of these topics, I'd definitely check out that channel. I also wanted to address another thing that a bunch of people had commented, and I sort of agree with. A lot of people were saying, hey, the biggest gang in Canada is really the police or the government. Now, I want to tread lightly because I sort of know where you're coming from, and I sort of disagree with you too. Obviously, police and government are necessities to civilization. At least that's what I believe. And the vast majority of people involved in the government and the police are good people. But the fact is that there are many people in these organizations that are terrible people. And it's really damaging when terrible people are part of the government or the police and they abuse that power. And in those situations, you can really make an argument for the fact that they're acting in a way that's very close to organized crime. And so I got a lot of comments along those lines, and I definitely know where you're coming from. And it's not just gangs out there that are doing terrible things to the world or hurting people or committing crimes. And there have been many cases where the government or the police or the military have committed crimes as part of that organization. And so that's a very complicated thing, and I don't want to go on and on about that, but I wanted to raise that point and say that I know where you're coming from to an extent. I mean, for example, honestly, I think that the United States military's involvement in the Vietnam War can and should be classified as crimes against humanity. And so that wraps up my video. I hope you found that overview interesting and informative. And on Sunday morning, I'm actually going to be posting a video on the gang situation in the city of Calgary, Alberta. There's obviously going to be a lot of overlap with the gangs in Edmonton video I posted, but Calgary definitely has some gang stories of its own I wanted to talk about, and so I'm really looking forward to that video as well. And again, I really appreciate people taking the time to watch this video. I know that your time is very valuable. It's the one resource that you can't get back. And so I'm very grateful to you for giving me your time. And if you're interested in watching more of my content in general, please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload about one new video per week, and honestly, most of my content is not gang related at all. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.